Hey everybody, JJ here, Bull, Boom, Bear, Bust. It is May 12th, it's Tuesday. Thank you for joining in today and welcome. Today we're going to talk about, is the dollar doomed? Is it going to be destroyed? And will we see skyrocketing prices because of the destruction of the dollar? It's going to be our main topic today. Also, the Fed has really stepped up its game in asset purchases. The Fed is manipulating now prices worldwide as it buys up assets, including junk bonds and ETFs. We're going to talk about what that means as it relates to the dollar and prices. Is inflation going to result from this? Well, inflation is not solely determined by the dollar, believe it or not. Regardless of what you have been told, let's get into the news today. Start off right here. This is a chart, the US dollar index. And if you look, you'll see that the dollar has not really dropped off a cliff. And in fact, over the past few years, it has gotten stronger. Well, what keeps the dollar so strong in times of unprecedented currency creation and dollar printing out of the central bank? Skyrocketing debt and deficits, bailouts now that are multiple times bigger than the 2008 financial crisis bailouts, which hardly anyone thought would ever happen, but we're here, it's happening. Well, the dollar is still king, and it's basically the boss currency around the globe, and pretty much every major country around the world is also under a fiat currency. And you probably know that there are countries that have had hyperinflation. They've had their currency essentially deemed worthless because of the printing. So then people make that leap into the dollar. They say, well, it's going to happen to the dollar. Well, not so fast. And we're going to talk about why that is. But first, let's take a look at some asset prices in some other countries that did witness the destruction of their currencies. For this, let's go over to goldrate24.com, and we see gold per ounce in Venezuela Bolivar is $422 million, just under $423 million per ounce. And of course, in the U.S., it's right around $1,700. So you can see how the destruction of a currency can really cause skyrocketing prices. In some of these countries, you also saw just drastic increases in food prices. For example, there was also a report out of Venezuela that 1 month's salary might buy you a dozen eggs if you're lucky. So here's a report right here that kind of outlines this. Euronews.com. Venezuela, 1 liter of milk could cost a third of your wage. Now, for such runaway prices and runaway inflation, you have to have more than just destroying the dollar, destroying the currency, I should say. You also have to have shortages. Now, what happens in a lot of these countries is you see socialism disincentivizing people from working. So therefore you have less production, less people farming, less people producing food and goods, but a lot of money thrown around because people are getting some sort of government paycheck. And it's that lethal combination is the money printing combined with the balance in supply and demand being thrown off. So when you encourage people not to work, not to farm, or when you throw in so many taxes and red tape that people are unable to farm, and you're starting to see it here in the US, you're starting to see a lot of farmers go bankrupt even before this whole COVID situation, right? The rising taxes and rising cost of living combined with severe weather and weather pattern changes, destroying crops, also a big part of it. You know, we do see farmers beginning to see very hard times here in the US, but for this to take place, there has to be a lethal combination of 1, excess money printing, or 2, supply and demand being thrown out of whack. And that can happen for many reasons. For example, many people were pointing to the Fed printing so many dollars and pumping so much currency into the banking system, into the economy. People said there was going to be runaway inflation, hyperinflation, $100,000 gold, $200 per barrel oil. It did not happen because supply and demand is also a major issue. So what happens when you have no demand for oil and you have a lot of oil being pumped out of the ground? You have deflation. You have prices dropping even though the Fed's printing dollars like crazy, right? So just because they're printing the dollar into oblivion doesn't mean there's going to be hyperinflation. There may be someday, but you also have to see that supply and demand ratio being thrown out of whack. And a good example of that is oil. The supply and demand ratio was severely impacted by the shutdown. Nobody's driving, or hardly anyone's driving. So you saw falling prices. So inflation and rising prices is not as simple as saying they're printing too many dollars. For example, we also saw rising prices in certain assets that we saw shortages of. Let's take a look at the rising meat prices here in the U.S. Right here, this is a chart here that shows the recent surge in meat prices. We had a lot of meat plants shutting down, and we've reported on this here, and it caused much less meat to be given out to the grocery stores, less meat on the shelves, more people panic buying, especially perishable items caused the prices to surge. All right, so on one hand you have falling, crashing oil prices, which have recovered some, but we did see a big crash in the oil price recently. And then you have skyrocketing prices in certain items, including meat and beef. We're seeing shortage. All right, so back to gold for a minute. Now, they could be manipulating the price of gold, and in fact, there was some market rigging going on with gold, and I think market rigging is going on all over the place. I think cryptos are being rigged. I think precious metals prices have been suppressed for a very long time, and there was actually some legal action that came out of that. And this rigging has been widely reported. Here's an article here out of ST Bullion, and I'll just read an excerpt here. This week we learned that U.S. authorities and the Department of Justice, who have for years not only accused various JP Morgan, Chase, and employees of rigging precious metals futures, but also got many to plead guilty. The U.S. Department of Justice is now, more importantly, building a criminal case against America's biggest bank itself. So this is ongoing, but let me just go ahead and summarize it to you like this. If the price of something can be rigged or manipulated with pushes of buttons, it's going to be done. It's going to be done. It's human nature. There's the greed factor. You're always going to see someone trying to make money behind the scenes, behind the curtain, whatever you want to call it. If they can rig it by pushing buttons, they absolutely will. I think the price of anything that's traded digitally can be manipulated. You name it: stocks, cryptos, commodities, anything that's sold on the futures market, anything that's tied to an ETF. It can all be manipulated. It's all rigged. And you probably heard me say multiple times that this economy is an illusionary economy. It's not real. The jobs are not real. Many jobs only exist today because of the ability for a central bank to create money out of nothing in unlimited quantities at pushes of buttons, really. And now it doesn't even have to be button pushing. You can have algorithms buy and sell, inject liquidity. It's far more automated than many people realize. So bottom line is, everything is rigged and manipulated. We don't have a free market. We haven't had a free market in a long time. We don't know what the price of anything really is when it comes to actual organic supply and demand without manipulation, right? So think about it. Without the loans and without the propping up of the banking system, which allows banks to continue to give out mortgages even though the banks don't have the money in reserves, without that fiat system, without that fractional reserve banking system that's propped up with unlimited money creation, prices of homes might be 20% of what they are right now. We don't know. If people actually had to go out and pay cash for homes, or you name it, autos, those prices could be drastically lower. Nobody really knows. It's impossible to know until we get back to a free market. Now, will we ever get back to a free market? Well, some people are saying that the dollar is at the end of its day, but it is still the world's reserve currency. It is still the king dollar. It is still the king currency. In fact, the US dollar was first printed starting in the early 1900s upon creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. And ever since the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, that established that central banks would maintain fixed exchange rates between their currencies and the dollar. And ever since then, essentially the dollar has been bossing the world around. And according to the IMF, the US dollar is the most popular currency in the world. As of the first quarter of 2020, it made up about 60% of all known central bank currency reserves. The next closest reserve currency is the euro, which makes up about 20% of known central bank foreign currency reserves. So even after all of this money printing and digitizing of the debt and currency, so again, let's go back to this dollar index chart. We see the dollar is still holding strong. It is still king dollar. It is still the world's reserve currency. But it doesn't mean we're not going to have imbalances in places. And as far as supply and demand, when you talk about gold and silver prices, you could still see surging gold and silver prices. We see a steady climb in gold prices, for example. even though the dollar is not getting smacked down like a lot of people think it is or like it should be. So that's what I am positioning in partially. Maybe about 10% of everything I have to invest is put in gold and silver. Yes, I do have some cryptos. I think they're going to be a bid upward minus the manipulation. They could still beat the price back down. But if enough people are convinced that the dollar is destroyed, the dollar doesn't actually have to be destroyed for enough people to go rushing into gold and silver. We're already seeing severe shortages of silver. If you go to SD Bullion or a lot of the online bullion dealers, there's a limited supply and a lot of it's on back order. So even with the dollar being king dollar, the world's reserve currency, I still think that after the manipulation is stopped, if it's ever stopped, and because of the fear and a lot of people rushing into metals, I still think we're going to see rising metals prices even amidst possibly a dollar that may maintain its strength. So I want to highlight again, inflation and prices in general is not solely determined by the dollar. It's supply and demand. For example, a piece of cardboard. You could have a specific piece of cardboard worth thousands of dollars. A piece of cardboard. If someone thinks it's rare enough, and take a look at baseball cards. A piece of cardboard can get you over $3 million. Some baseball player, a card of a baseball player that came out in the early 1900s, because it's rare and hard to find, or it's a special card, maybe it's a rookie card. Look at this Mickey Mantle card worth $2.8 million. So supply and demand, if somebody thinks something is rare or valuable, right, it all depends on if there's going to be a buyer. There might be a person that won't give you 50 cents because they're going to look at it as a piece of cardboard, but somebody that recognizes it as something that's rare might give you millions of dollars for it, a collector. And I'm not saying to go out and invest in baseball cards. I'm just saying that even a piece of cardboard, if there's people out there that thinks it's valuable and that'll give you money for it, then it's valuable. And from there, I really think we're going to see a lot of people running into precious metals like they are already. And I think at some point when it's unleashed, it's going to be skyrocketing upward. I don't know the date. I don't have the exact date on that, but I do know that in the future you'd be well prepared or better prepared to have some precious metals in your portfolio. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you like what we talk about, please smash that like button and subscribe and come back for more. See you then. Bye.